Hello knitters, Barbara Benson here. I'm an independent knitwear designer who also likes to make videos here on my YouTube channel, Watch Barbara Knit. If you would like to know more about my knitwear designs, please check in the description below, and there you will find a link to my Ravelry page where you will find images of all the patterns I have designed, and you can get a PDF to knit one up yourself. If you do decide to knit up one of my patterns, I would absolutely love to hear about it. You can either talk to me in the comments below the YouTube video, or you can also check in the description for a link to the Watch Barbara Knits Facebook group, where it is a closed group, but you can come on over and I will approve you, and there we can continue this conversation. And the great thing about Facebook is we can also share pictures and things like that. So, without further ado, today I have decided to talk with you guys about something that I know you are always incredibly super excited to do. It's your favorite part of every project. It's making your gauge swatch, right? I know that people just want to jump right into their project, but I'm here to tell you, and I decided I wanted to make this video because if you want your project to be the best that it can be, you really do need to do a gauge swatch. And I'm here to talk to you about the why and the how of doing a gauge swatch and maybe hopefully convert you. First thing is, what exactly is a gauge swatch? A gauge swatch is you taking the exact yarn and the exact needle and whatever your pattern calls for, whatever stitch pattern that it gives you gauge in that specific stitch pattern, and knitting up a little small version of it so you can see if that yarn and that needle with your hands gives you the appropriate gauge, because every single knitter knits at a different tension. And when a pattern says knit this on an 8, what it really says I, as the person who knit this original pattern, knit it on an 8. But you, as a knitter, need to use whatever needle size you need to use to achieve the gauge that I got. Now, the number one thing that people think of when they think of gauge when they do their gauge swatches is getting gauge if you're doing a garment so that that garment will fit, which is absolutely 100% correct. Because if they're telling you you're getting X number of stitches per inch and you're getting more stitches per inch or fewer stitches per inch, that's going to change how big that garment is. And it's the difference between having a garment that fits you well or one that's way too tight or possibly appropriate for a gorilla. You know, giant long arms all the way down to your knees. That is what no gauge can do for you. But your gauge swatch also tells you other things. Your gauge swatch definitely tells you fit, but your gauge swatch also talks to you about drape. And what drape is how dense or floppy your fabric is going to be. And different items need to be knit with different levels of drape. If you're going to be making a shawl that you expect to be draping over your shoulders and being able to ball up and move around, or a scarf, like a flowy scarf, you want a good drape. Good drape usually means you're going to get fewer stitches per inch, because then the stitches are going to be looser and be able to flop around more. Whereas if you are knitting a sock, you're going to want a very dense gauge because you want a whole bunch of stitches per inch to make something that's firm, that is going to last a long time and stand up to wear and form to your foot. The same thing if you want to knit like a super warm sweater, you're going to be working at a denser gauge. It's going to have a tighter drape. It's not going to drape. It's going to be stiff, but that's what you're actually going for. So not only are you looking for the fit, but you're looking for the drape. And then a third really significant thing that gauge tells you is, if you think about how many stitches per inch you're getting, each of those stitches takes up a certain amount of yarn. And all of the math on that particular piece that you're doing is based on you getting that gauge. So if you don't have the correct gauge, you might run out of yarn. And nobody likes that, really. They don't. So your yardage that you use is entirely dependent on your gauge. So those are three big reasons. Yes, you want it to fit, but you also want it to have the correct drape, and you want it to use up the amount of yarn that the pattern says it's going to use. So for all of those reasons, you need to do a gauge swatch, and because it's going to allow the piece to be what the designer envisioned it would be. If you want it to look like the picture, then you need to get your appropriate gauge. So that's the why. Now, how? A couple things. If you are going, as I said, you use the yarn and the needle that you're going to use for that project. If you are going to knit your project flat, then you swatch flat. If you are going to knit your project in the round, then you need to swatch in the round. Because when you're knitting flat, you're usually knitting in one direction and predominantly purling in the other direction. Whereas if you're knitting in the round, you just go knit, 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 knit. And the tension that you have when you're knitting versus when you're purling is different. So a stockinette knit flat versus stockinette knit in the round is going to have a slightly different gauge depending on how you knit. The same thing for garter. Garter knit flat is just knit, 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 knit. Garter knit in the round, you have to knit around and purl around and knit around and purl around. So those two things are going to have different gauge. So you need to swatch in the manner that you will be actively creating your piece. And in that same vein, you haven't finished your swatch until you've actually blocked it the way that you are going to care for your finished piece. So the gauge that is given in the pattern is going to be the blocked gauge. So you have to knit your swatch, bind it off, and block it the way that you are planning on blocking your finished piece. So if you're making a big lace shawl that you are going to block the snot out of, you need to block the snot out of your swatch. If you are knitting a sweater that your plan is to throw it in the washing machine and then pull it out and lay it flat to dry, that's how you need to treat your swatch. It's just there. If you're going to like steam, if your plan is I'm going to wear this sweater and never ever wash it, and every time the only way I'm going to clean it is by steaming it, then fine, steam your swatch. But if you're going to work that, I mean, if you ever want to wash the piece, then you need to wash your swatch. Especially because there are so many different ways that different fibers behave once they've been washed. Silk tends to elongate, they can bloom, alpaca gets big and fuzzy. You need to know how that is going to happen. And also, there's a couple other really good reasons to wash your swatch. Wash your swatch. That is hard to say. Washing your swatch will it will tell you if it's going to bleed, especially if you're going to do stripes or something like that. Make sure you lay it out on like something white and you'll see if it bleeds. Just block it on top of a paper towel. I mean, whatever. You'll see if it's going to bleed. It tells you how it's going to behave. It tells you if it's going to bloom. It tells you if it's going to shrink. You need to block that swatch. And it's because the gauge numbers you're given by the designer is that blocked, unless the piece doesn't call for blocking. I mean, sometimes it'll say unblocked, because there are times, because you're trying to achieve a certain type of texture, that maybe you're not going to. But, okay, that is, you need to, I've told you why you should, and a couple things on how, and then the nitty gritty, okay? So, with your gauge information, it is going to give it to you in number of stitches and number of rows per unit of measurement. Okay, what we're going to work with right now is, and I wrote all this math down to make sure I got it right, 20 stitches and 28 rows in 4 inches. That means when you measure across here and count the number of stitches then you are going to get 20 stitches in 4 inches. This is a super handy dandy tool to have. You place it on top and you can see and you count the number of stitches in the number of inches that you have, and that gives you stitch per inch. Same thing for the rows. You place it vertically on it and you count the number of stitches that you get within a set amount of measurement. Now, what I want to make clear is more likely than not, well, I mean, you might not. You might be the awesomest swatcher in the world, and if you are, go for it. But it is possible that you might not be casting on enough stitches to get an accurate measurement. I provide the vast majority of my accessory patterns are, I only give 2 inches worth. I tell you how many stitches are in 2 inches because I know it's a shawl and you're very unlikely to actually swatch. But I want you to at least try, so I try to make it as simple as possible. I provide it over 2 inches and I provide you a stockinette gauge because that's what you're most likely to do. And what that is telling you is what if you're getting the correct drape and if your yardage is going to be accurate. Because with a shawl, we're not particularly concerned about fit. When you're looking at garments or something that's going to fit, you're going to be looking at something probably over 4 inches. Now, what gauge is not, in our example, 20 stitches equals 4 inches. It doesn't mean you cast on 20 stitches, knit 20 stitches for 24 rows, and then try to block it to be 4 inches. That's not the way it works. What you do is you need to cast on substantially more stitches so that you are measuring out a little chunk outside of the middle that doesn't have any interference with any of your edge stitches. Same thing with knitting in the round. You need to cast on enough in the round that when you flatten it out, you have over 4 inches to measure in because you don't want to mess with those edge stitches. So what I would advise in our example, so we have 20 stitches in 4 inches, okay? So you take that 20 divided by 4, so you get 5 stitches per inch. So what you would want to do is cast on the 20 stitches plus an inch on either side. So in total, you're going to cast on 30 stitches, right? Now, we have 28 rows in 4 inches. 28 divided by 4 gives us 7 rows per inch. We're going to add 2 inches. So we're going to knit our 30 rows. No, our 30 stitches and knit 42 rows. See, I wrote all this math down because numbers and me. So 30 inches, 42 rows. That way we have an inch all the way around. If you're knitting flat, I advise to do the first couple rows in garter and then have garter on either side, just 2 stitches. This is overkill, just so that it doesn't roll and annoy you. But you need to have enough space in the middle that once you've blocked it, you can measure easily. You don't want to be cramping up against the edges or you're not going to get an accurate read of what your gauge is going to be. Now, you also need to check and make sure what stitch pattern your pattern is actually saying your gauge is in, because I'm talking about stockinette here, but it might be giving you gauge over garter or a specific texture stitch or a lace stitch. You need to look at that and you have to knit the gauge in whatever they're giving. You have to knit your swatch in whatever they're telling you to knit it in. But the big thing I wanted you to realize is that you probably need to knit a bigger swatch than you think you do. Now, I am going to confess, I have been known to frog swatches. I have been known to knit my swatch, bind it off, leave it attached to the ball, put the ball in a Ziploc bag, wash it, block it, do everything to it while it's still attached to the ball of yarn, because I'm afraid I'm going to run out of yarn like everyone else. So, you know, it's good to keep your swatches, but you know, if you have wiggle room, I mean, the knitting police aren't going to come get you, but I really, really highly advise that you knit that gauge swatch. Now, Some things that people do, people who keep their gauge swatches, is kind of cool. They'll do like knit two together yarn overs across the bottom. Like, so if they're knitting it on a size 5, they'll do that 5 times. So you have 5 holes across the bottom. So you knit that swatch on a size 5. Or people will leave a big long tail and tie 5 knots in that tail. So you know that you knit that on a size 5. But again, as I said, you need to know what size 5 you knit it on, because knitting your swatch on a metal needle, which is slick, versus knitting your swatch on a bamboo needle, which is going to have less give, is going to give you a different gauge, which is actually a fantastic thing to know. Because if you've knit your gauge swatch and you've blocked your gauge swatch and you've measured your gauge swatch and you're off by a little bit, simply switching the material of your needle can give you a half a stitch or a half a row here or there. So if you're just slightly off, you can play with that. I hope that this has at least enlightened you. Maybe I mentioned something you didn't already know, but hopefully I've convinced you that you need to learn to embrace the gauge swatch. It is an important part of your knitting if you want your knitting to be the absolute best that it can be. If you like this video, please give it the thumbs up, click that like button. And if you would like to be notified whenever I upload a new video, please subscribe to my channel and select notifications. And if you like this video or think that someone you know is a knitting friend who might find it useful, check below and you will find a share button. It looks like a little arrow, and please feel free to share it on any social media that you'd like. Thank you so much.